turn it over to you. And for everyone else who's never met you before, give us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and your background.
Great. Thank you. Who I am, I guess many people would say a Renaissance man. So I do a lot of different things, everything from woodworking and carpentry to a lot of nonprofit work and family time, right? And business, while it's a passion of mine and while I love what I do, it really is more a means to an end. It enables me to do what I want to do, which has really helped people. That's kind of my passion. My wife and I share that passion, and it's been a great way to connect as a family and in our relationship. Professionally, I'm a business coach or business consultant, a business mechanic, whatever terminology you want to use. Normally that focuses on helping an organization to set a strategy and a direction of where they want to go, and then lay out the plan on how to get there and how to execute that plan, to kind of fill in the gap that most organizations that have a strategic plan never get to the execution part. So that's what I do professionally. And it's interesting that a highly controversial thing that you mentioned with my LinkedIn, and I get that a lot, is why doesn't it have the typical list of, corporate entities? And the reality is I've worked for a lot of companies. I've consulted with almost 300 or maybe over 300 now, different companies. And no one of them is more important than the other. And I can't list 300 plus companies. So I just generally put, here I am, kendallpeterson.me, and these are the things that I do. That's why I did it that way.
So before you switched your LinkedIn, though, years ago or somewhere in the interim, you did have some of the companies. So could you just hit just the highlights? Like, I know you worked at FPL for a while. Well, actually, before the corporate experience, tell me a little bit about your educational background, because you're an engineer, is that right? By training, or by education?
By degree, yes.
By degree, yeah.
So I really, my path, I wanted to be an astronaut when I was growing up. So everything was geared towards that. Had some struggles in high school, from a family perspective, that derailed that path. And so I tried to piece it back together. I wanted to study engineering. I wanted to go in the Navy as a Navy pilot. That was the path that I was on. And I was trying to still piece together all of the little things that would get me to space. That led me to studying nuclear engineering through a degree program that Florida Power and Light offered. I became a commercial nuclear plant operator and studied nuclear engineering as part of their program. And then later, when I wound up more in the business end of things, studied industrial engineering and was able to piece, both of those together. So not as though I design and build things, although I certainly have an interest in the way things work and the way things are designed. I'm more of a practical business engineer, if you would.
So I think that's important only for context, right? Because obviously your work has been much more varied than just being an engineer.
Right.
But coming from a background of, I have a degree in accounting, and I worked in the accounting and finance world for a while, but my work now, similar to you, is very, very divergent from that type of work. But I think it's good context for people to understand. I think the stereotype of accountants and engineers both is that we tend to be analytical, linear thinkers. I think you kind of break that mold with what you've done with your life in the bigger picture. So you've got the engineering background, you worked at Florida Power and Light. How did you go from that type of work to getting to the coaching part of things?
It was one giant leap for mankind, so to speak. So when I went to work for Florida Power and Light, I went into the nuclear industry. I was still wanting to become an astronaut, although it was becoming very clear that mountain was very steep. I did apply. I did get shot down, and and I had to figure out what to do. That had been a dream of mine since I was 3 years old and watched Neil Armstrong land on the moon. Although it was grainy and small black and white TV, and I didn't really know what I was looking at 3 years old, the excitement around it really kind of drove that. So when I got rejected, I had to figure out, all right, now what? And I had just the luxury in that organization at Florida Power and Light. They were in pursuit of the W. Edwards Deming Award for Quality and the Malcolm Baldrige Award. They went after them back to back. So I had received a tremendous amount of training and instruction in quality improvement, QIP, QIDW, all of the acronyms that are just built around making businesses better. The other part of that is to overshare maybe a little bit, but in that troubled time in my teenage years, I wound up being homeless. And so I was 15 years old. I was living behind a dumpster at a diner, and it kind of forced me into a thinking mindset. So I am naturally a problem solver. I am naturally somebody that likes to know how things work. And I think that's where the engineering part comes in. But I was trying to figure out, how did this happen? And how are some people successful and some people not successful? So it was a problem to solve, if you will. And so that natural tendency and that life-changing experience, combined with all of the wonderful opportunities that I had at Florida Power and Light, really came together. And it occurred to me that really maybe I'm not meant to go to space, or not meant to go to space yet, because I'm still holding out hope. But really, I can bring my skills, I can bring my natural tendencies to bear on making organizations better. So that's how it started. And I worked for Florida Power and Light for 16 years. And it was time to cut loose and do my own thing. So that's what I did. I started a little consulting company, and we had a particular focus on more emergency management and business continuity at the time. And that began the snowball effect of really the great opportunities that I have right now, and helping organizations grow. I've helped 8 different organizations grow to $1 billion plus. I have, I've helped a tremendous number of companies. I've had 11 of my own. So there's a lot of learning combined with the natural tendencies that bring me to today. So.
Of those 11 businesses, was there any common thread in terms of either the industry that they were in, or the mission? What was the common thread, if any, of those 11 businesses of yours?
An opportunity to fill a need, I think, was the common thread. They've been very diverse in terms of what we provided, starting with the business continuity and disaster recovery work that we did, that became then more technical into the IT type space. So that brought me into working with a number of tech companies. Then I started a tech company of my own, and that one was focused on, it was the tech back end to helping kind of what became Angie's List or those types of services. It was called Qualistar, and we paired small businesses, small service providers with homeowners, which led into the next iteration, which was we were able to help those small businesses. So they were really great roofers or great pressure cleaning people, but they couldn't run a business to save their life. And we needed them to be viable, and we needed them to be sound. So we took on more and more of the back end work, which gave birth to a business services company that we started, or that I started. On into, I've had an educational robotics company. I've had, other types of consulting type things. It's been all over the place. And it usually just, the way I see the world is as a business opportunity. There's a need, then you can start a business and you can make it happen.
So that sounds great for most people, but most people drop the ball on the stuff that you help them with, right? To your point about they may be a good, I always like to use just by default a mechanic, because I think it's something people can relate to, and everybody's been to a mechanic before. A mechanic works for some other mechanic for years and then realizes, geez, I've got a lot of people that know me and I'm really good at what I do. I should just have my own shop. And then they open one and then eventually realize, holy crap, I can fix cars like crazy, but I don't know anything about marketing and admin and legal and HR and all these other things. But it seems like a lot of that came naturally to you. Do you feel like it came naturally? Or was it something that you kind of stumbled at, failed, and just kind of failed forward and learned?
It's maybe a combination of the two. It's a great question.
Okay.
There are some things, I think all of us, we have natural skills and talents. Mine is just kind of organizing chaos, which explains the business world, you know, in a nutshell. But so keeping things organized, keeping things moving, knowing what things are priorities, that's really where my strength is. And then the rest is a combination of failure. I have failed a lot. You know, not all 11 businesses went on to become Fortune 500 companies, right? There's a reason you've never heard of them. But I learned a tremendous amount in those failures as well. I learned about the value of marketing. I learned about the value of sales. I learned about the value of selecting the right partners and things like that. But also I've had the luxury of working with a lot of other companies and kind of figuring their parts out as well. And sometimes you have to call on experts and people that really get it. I do everything but the financial end of the company. I realized early on, it's a language that I don't speak. I'm sure you can appreciate that. It is, to me, it's overcomplicated and I just don't have a tolerance for it. I understand, you know, the P&L level, and I understand money comes in and you manage it wisely. That I get. But then you get into a whole lot of ways of measuring success and things you do with money. So I know to stay away from that, and that what I need in business are people that speak that language. And so that's another important lesson, is to know what you're good at and stay in that lane, and know what you're not, and know when you need to bring other people in for that. Nobody's good at all of it, right?
Yeah, the thing you said about the financial end of things, I've always found interesting that whenever people ask me about or comment on, oh, you're an accountant, you must know XYZ, right? Sometimes I'll have to feel like I have to clarify that many people have this misconception that accounting is about math, which could not be further from the truth. The part about accounting that's math is just a little sliver of it. And what I explain to people that I hope helps them understand a little better is that accounting is just an accumulation of rules that were made by people. Right. And they change all the time. And they change because there are people that want to make rules that benefit them. And so if you go through like just the tax code, just as one example, there's all these loopholes that were created by people who had the means to get that loophole created. Yeah. And a lot of the rules in accounting make no sense. So when people say, gosh, I feel stupid when I try to, you know, figure out XYZ thing about accounting, well, don't feel stupid. Some guy in a room somewhere made that up, and it made all the sense in the world for his purposes. Right. But it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to most people because your purpose is not their purpose. You said a couple of things I want to follow up on, which is partners. That is something that I have struggled with my entire career, both in terms of a partner as an employer, finding an employer as a partner that I felt like I could stay with and be happy with and grow with. And then since I've worked for myself, finding business partners. So what are some of the things that you feel like were factors that led you to partners that led to successful businesses?
It's a great question. And it's more art than science. It really is. At the end of the day, your partner it's a relationship like any other relationship. And really, to a certain degree, it's a marriage, right? Because if you do it correctly, there's a contractual element to it. But there's also the human element to it. And so I always recommend when you're looking at a business partner, just because you share the same idea of, hey, this could really be something big, does not mean you're going to be good partners. any more than it means when you go on a first date and you guys both like sushi. It does not mean that you're going to live a life of happiness and joy. And so what's that?
It doesn't work that way.
It's hard to believe, right? Sushi might, lead you astray, but you have to spend the time to develop the relationship, and it's an intimate relationship, right? In a number of ways. You're mixing money, you're mixing your personalities, you're mixing in a very tense environment, a pressure cooker, if you will, all of these ingredients that can really have a disastrous effect. So your partnership agreement becomes very important when you're finding a partner. But all of the pre-work, spend the time with the person, understand them, know what their triggers are. And at the end of the day, we're all wounded children, right? And so we're going to bring all of this stuff to our relationship, even in business, and understand those things and understand what those triggers are. And then it's just a matter of, are you willing to make the compromises that it will take to have that work? And that's the best I've been able to find.
That's a great answer, because it's so complicated. You touched on some of the things that I think are pretty universal, right? The people part of it, spending the time, and not looking at it just with that left brain logical, oh, they have skills that I don't have. Okay, maybe we should be partners. So one of the experiences that I had years ago that I'd love to get your perspective on. So I'll say company names. It doesn't matter because it's a big public company, and I no bad things to say about the company. But they're Primerica. They're a multi-level marketing financial services company. I had a really bad association with multi-level marketing before I got involved with them. But when I started working with that company, basically as a financial advisor, although they kind of market it differently, I was one of those few people that actually wanted to help people with their money, because I had an accounting background that knew how important it was for people to understand how to manage their money. And the guy who I basically worked in his office, his mantra to me was, if you want what I have, do what I did. And I would see the checks that he got every month. It was like $50,000, $60,000 a month in mostly residual income that he got from this business that he'd built over a number of years. And so I kept trying to buy into, if you want what I have, do what I did. And then the more and more time I spent around him, I saw how he was when he talked to his wife, when he talked to the office manager, when he talked to other people, his values leaked out.
Yeah.
And it just subconsciously, I think I started to torpedo my own efforts, because he got an override. He made money on all the business I brought in. And initially that was sort of sold to me like, well, why would I ever steer you wrong? I have a financial interest in you. And more, it just started to bother me that his ethics didn't seem to line up with mine. And I eventually got out of that business. So I'm curious, everything about your profile screams what I assume are your personal values being way more important than your business stuff. So I'm curious, what are the values that for you are the ones that are sort of foundational, that have helped you through? Because I think that's one of the roles values serve for everyone, is they kind of help us through all the ups and downs of life. What are some of the big ones for you?
I just as in full transparency, right? Transparency, sorry. I hold values very dear that I have broken in my life, right? And so setting values and having values, I agree with you. They are a choice on how you want to behave as you're doing what you do, right? And when I teach strategic planning and when I lead strategic planning, core values is one of the 5 things that we do, because I believe it drives everything. Now, I value integrity tremendously. But there have been circumstances in my life where I've not lived with integrity. And so to me, the values that I hold dear, integrity, I call love a value, right? Because it's a choice, and I define it in a very particular way, based on St. Thomas Aquinas had the definition of love that resonated the most with me, which was to will the good of the other as other. In other words, I love you, John, not because of what you do for me, but because I truly want your good, right? So I put that as a value. I value that so much that that's how I want to live my life. I value integrity because I don't ever want you to question whether or not I'm being honest with you or I'm being true and faithful in a relationship and all of those things. So those two are tops in my book. Openness is something that I had to learn over time. In my early years, and I had mentioned the homelessness, I hid that from everyone. I basically bottled up and boxed up my life and wouldn't share who I was or what I was or my experiences with anybody because I was embarrassed. And what I realized over time is there is no intimacy without vulnerability, right? I have to make myself vulnerable in order to form any meaningful relationship, whether that's a business partnership or a friendship or a marriage, or even with my kids, right? So those are my top three, the top three values. And I'm always striving for them. And I know it sounds stupid that, I'm striving for integrity. Why don't I just have integrity? And sometimes you justify compromises, and I have in my life. So I hold on to those as aspirational goals and things that I am 100% devoted to working on. And when I fail, I pick myself up and I keep working on it.
I find it interesting, and I'm reading into this, so if I'm reading into it incorrectly, feel free to correct me, but I feel like I'm picking up that you kick yourself a little bit when you're not perfect in upholding these values.
You should probably read more into that, because I do more than kick myself a little bit. I mean, I'm my by far my harshest critic, and I get called out for that a lot by my wife.
Okay, kudos to your wife then.
Yeah,
because I have that same problem. If it is I'll call it a problem for myself. I'm not going to throw that on you, but for me, I find it to be problematic when it goes too far. Right, it can be a good thing, I think, to say if I'm living in a situation of cognitive dissonance, right, where here's how I want to be and here's how I actually am. That gap in between causes me pain because I'm not living my values. But I have to remind myself sometimes, hey, we're like living, breathing human beings. Yeah. We're mistake-making machines. It's kind of how we work. And whether you look to religion to say that we're not perfect, we strive for that, but we're not perfect, and that's okay. Or if you look at it from more of a left brain thinking point of view, that, well, human psychology tells us, a lot of research says that's kind of, we just are that way. But I think in a way, tell me if this resonates with you. I think the degree to which you kick yourself for not living up to your values has a lot to do with how high your bar is in various things.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's really two parts to that in my mind. One is, if my goal is perfection, then I've set a goal that I simply cannot achieve. The reality is I cannot achieve it. I should point toward perfection and set some goal that's lofty but achievable. And because if you set a goal that's not achievable, then you'll eventually realize in your subconscious that that's not achievable, and you stop striving for it. That's human nature. And the other part of it that I think is really important is that behavior of living in the I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, I can't, is really self-defeating. And that's a learning that I've had in my life. I'll give you a great example of how apparent that is to other people when we don't. Sometimes I'll convince myself that it's humility, right? I was at a conference one time, and I was talking to a guy, and he wanted to take a picture with my business partner, myself, and I backed out of the picture. And he said, no, come on, I want you in the picture. And I said, I'm the least important person here. I don't need to be in the picture. And he legitimately stopped everything, turned to me and said, don't you ever do that again. And I was kind of taken aback because I didn't know him. And he's a consultant. This is the guy
asking for the picture, not your partner saying that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. It wasn't my partner, although he later agreed. My partner agreed with him. And this was the kind of calling out that I need. But he said, you call yourself a business coach and a consultant. He said, how are you going to convince anybody that you can help them if you don't believe in yourself? And just that, it was a real slap in the face, just short of the physical slap in the face, but it really moved me. And I need that every now and then, because that is my tendency. And it comes, from a long history of hearing it, believing it, and then perpetuating it myself.
So it sounds like you and I share some imposter syndrome.
Probably, yeah.
So I find it interesting that you touched on something that is one of the biggest reasons that I don't market myself very much as a coach. So on my LinkedIn and some of my marketing materials for my business, you'll see the word coach here and there, but I've never actively gone out and tried to get someone to hire me as a coach. And yet I've been through on the look at me wall, one of those back there is a certificate from Tony Robbins coaching program. Went through the program, and at the end of that program, I thought, but do I really have the experience to show somebody that, hey, I did this, I can show you how to do that. And one of the pieces of feedback that I got from one of the instructors in the coaching program was that it's a very common stumbling block for new coaches to feel that imposter syndrome and feel like I have to embody the perfection of whatever it is I'm trying to coach them on. But people don't want a perfect coach. They want a real coach. They want someone who actually can help them get results. But I personally think the more somebody presents themselves as being perfect, the more my bullshit meter goes off and the red flags go up, and I go, wait a minute, nobody's as perfect, right? Even Tony Robbins, who I think, I've always looked up to him as, I think, one of the best self-improvement people out there. And yet here's a guy who preaches about the importance of relationships and love and family. And he had a divorce many, many years ago, right? He didn't have a perfect relationship. Shit happens, right? He learned from it. He moves on. Apparently still has a great, relationship with his ex-wife and all of that. So I find it interesting. It's that the thing about the cobbler's children often have no shoes. Mm-hmm. You probably preached a million times to clients who have hired you, hey, don't beat yourself up so much about that. Hey, you don't have to be perfect. Let's just look at improving, right? And then we look at ourselves and we go, yeah, but I got to be perfect. So I want to share a quote with you. As you were talking, I remembered this quote that I heard from a guy named Alex Hormozy. I don't know if you know who he is. Him and his wife have a portfolio of companies that does 100 million-ish revenue a year. And he puts out a lot of good stuff. And one of the things he said that struck me was perfectionism is actually procrastination dressed up as quality control or masquerading as quality control. And when I heard him say that, I thought, holy crap, I'm embarrassed at how much that resonates with me. Mm-hmm. If I'm honest with myself, sometimes I'll put something off and I'm telling myself it's because I have to be at a certain level of quality before I can do the thing. And the reality is we should probably do the thing, screw it up as least we can, learn and get better, and then keep doing the thing until we're at a level that we can live with ourselves at that particular thing. I think values are similar. I mean, you have that value, you're never going to be perfect at that value. And one of the examples I've remembered from the Tony Robbins training was, most of the times that we're not happy, it is not because of the circumstance itself. It's because of the disconnect between the circumstance and our expectation. Mm-hmm. Right. So when I was in college, I lived in a really shitty mobile home. There's nothing wrong with mobile homes. The one I lived in happened to be really shitty. There was literally grass growing up through the floors. Like, I would take a jacket out and there was like those little picker things you get when you walk the field. Anyway, I could not have cared less. I was happy as a pig in shit living there, because I just never expected that I was going to live in someplace great while I was in college. I expected that I was supposed to be poor, and that was part of my paying my dues. But if I were to live today in that same place, I'd probably be really unhappy with it, because my expectation is I should have earned my way to something better. And so there's that disconnect. You said something earlier that I want to go back to, which is that we're all wounded children, right? So I'm curious what your thoughts are on, so traditional psychology and the way traditional psychologists administer therapy is they diagnose a problem, they come up with a plan of action or treatment, and it usually tends to be a fairly long-term thing in traditional therapy, right? Tony Robbins is very famous for changing people in an instant, right? He'll take someone who's suicidal, he does his thing with them, and in very, very short order, he gets them over these suicidal thoughts and gets them on a much more positive path in a very, very short period of time. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts, especially since you brought up we're all wounded children, on, do we have to stay in that and constantly go back and work on whatever the source of that wound was to sort of get that behind us and not let it impact us negatively? Or do you think with the right approach, someone actually can get over that wound from childhood in very short order and never have to revisit that?
It's a great question. And you know, I don't want to, Abraham Maslow, right? The great thinker that he was, back in the 1960s, had a great quote among the hierarchy of needs and all of the other stuff that he came up with. He said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. And I think that we got stuck in that for a while, in the psychological realm of saying, okay, there's this therapy that can help, but it takes a really, really long time, right? In fact, there's a joke: how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? One, but it takes a really long time, and the light bulb really has to want to change. And you know, I think that was just the mode of operation for a long time, and so we grew accustomed to that. But there have been a lot of advancements and a lot of things. And I remember, you know, I grew up like you. I was listening to Tony Robbins early, and he had a tremendous influence on me, and probably helped me over a number of obstacles. And he didn't even know it, right? He has no idea who I am. But he has this charisma that he brings, that make you want to participate. And I think that's a secret. That's, at some level, that's a secret to why he is successful in doing that. Now, I'll tell you, I grew up in a damaging home. Both my parents were alcoholics. Not to get too personal here, but there was a lot of damage created, things that I have paid for my entire life. And it came to a head with my wife, who refused to give up on me when I left her, and knew that in the end I was a damaged child. And we were able to work through a number of things. Now, there was some remarkable healing in a short amount of time. So I said all of that just to say, yes, I believe it's not always a long path. I believe also that it has a lot to do with the delivery method. It has a lot to do with your willingness to want to get over those things, your willingness to want to be different, your acceptance of the fact that you're dysfunctional, as a result of those things. And all of those are factors. I will tell you, one of the great things that I did was something called EMDR. And it's a therapy that they use a lot on victims of PTSD and things like that. Now, we stumbled on it in our family while we're working through everything else. I have 6 children. 3 of them are biological, and my youngest 3 we adopted out of foster care. So they have a number of things they deal with just because of the conditions. And as we were in some mandatory training class, to be foster parents, I listened to a gentleman explain that the way your brain holds on to memory is a lot like a file cabinet, and that it groups experiences by type, if you will. And so really, when you see these crazy responses, or you see a response that just seems out of the ordinary for the condition, usually what's happening is your brain is grabbing all associated memories. And so it's 90% past and only 10% what you're dealing with in the moment. And that's why it seems so radical or extreme. And when I heard that, it made so much sense, because I was dealing with some of those things. In literally 3 sessions, it really calmed down some parental issues that I had. But I've also found, healing in a lot of places, dealing with things with my wife. In my faith, we do a lot of ministry work, and there has been a lot of change there as well. So I 100% believe that it doesn't have to be a long, hard road to make some very significant positive change.
Interesting. EMDR is one I've not heard of. I'll definitely look that up, because I'm endlessly fascinated with everything and anything that has to do with why the heck do we do the things that we do? Because so many people that are legitimately highly intelligent people still do some stupid stuff from time to time. Yeah. And that's always fascinating me, even from when I was a kid.
Well, I see that. And that's one of the great things for me. I don't think I could be the coach that I am if I weren't personally dealing with all of those things. Because the reality is, if I get called in to sit with a CEO and he wants to be a better leader, right? The business environment is only one part of his leadership. It's really what he brings personally to it that I wind up dealing with the most. And usually, I'm not a therapist. I don't pretend to be a therapist. I don't play one on television. And I make a very strong disclaimer. I'm not a therapist. But in my experience, I can walk you back to where you can recognize certain things. And usually those are the trigger moments. And sometimes we can make progress. I've probably not seen as much success as Tony Robbins, but I've seen some remarkable breakthroughs just in the willingness of somebody to go back and listen. And that's where the coach comes in, right? I am a guide, I'm a companion, I'm there to hold their hand and walk them through certain circumstances. And then if they need therapy, then they can go find that. And that's the largest part of being a coach, and where I find the success. If it were just me teaching them how to be, how do you lead? Okay, we could do that in 5 minutes. This is how you lead. But it's usually getting out of your own way to better leadership, which is the strength in coaching.
Yeah, there's actually at the end of that Robbins training that I went through, there was a discussion about how one of the things you should do in your first coaching session is to explain that you are not a therapist, and here are some of the key differences between coaching and therapy. And if you need therapy, there's lots of great people out there, but I'm not a therapist. There's a whole list of things that they go through to kind of make it clear on what we do and we don't do as coaches. And you said something that reminded me of a phrase that you've probably heard a million times. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear.
Yeah.
And we get these lessons over and over again that have the potential to change us in a moment, but we're just not ready for them. And I won't get overly personal either with oversharing, but I had a traumatic experience when I was a teenager that I would say for 30 plus years caused me a lot of strife and guilt and kicking myself. And literally in one conversation, it was probably 5 minutes of a conversation. It was like this, just this weight got lifted. It's never come back. I still think about it and process it, and there are still things that bother me, but it's never since that conversation been like this albatross around my neck. And I think part of it was the student was ready. The teacher appeared, and it was not a long lesson. It was a very short conversation, but that same conversation 5 years prior, 10 years, whatever, I wasn't ready to hear it.
Yeah.
I was caught up in my own stories. Tony Robbins shows how old this is, this idea that he put out there, these tapes that we have running in our head, right? These stories, like they're just on an endless loop, and a lot of it is I am statements, right? That keep us there. Sorry, I got a little off track. I didn't mean to go on that track on myself, but I wanted to bring that up to drive home the point. It's not about your experience, my experience. It's not unique to your or my experience. I think for everyone that is true. That when the teacher is ready to, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. I want to go back to something you mentioned about your businesses. So you said you had started 11 businesses. Have you sold all of them? Are you still partners in a more passive way and kind of have moved on to other things? Or what is your involvement today with the businesses that you started?
Some I sold, some we dissolved, through partnership issues. Some, some, just kind of gave up on because, at some point, I have 6 kids, I have my own business, and, I wind up with all of these others. At some point you have to make a decision. I had a really great one that I was super excited about. And I just had to decide I can't do everything, and that this one's going to have to be set aside. So I still technically have it, but it's idle. So they're all in varying degrees of either, smoldering flames, or, they continue to be a success, but part of someone else's business.
Gotcha. Okay. One of the ones I wanted to ask you about, and I should know more about this, but since you've deleted them from your LinkedIn, it would require more homework. So I thought, get it from the horse's mouth here. Costa Farms. Talk to me about Costa Farms, because that was just talk to me about Costa. I don't want to show my ignorance by
That's okay.
Talking assumptions about it.
So I had a really great opportunity because of some issues in our family and one of our children that really needed a lot of help. I wound up taking 3 years off of work, and when it was time to come back, we were living out of state. We were living in Connecticut at the time, and just we needed family support and everything. So we moved back to Miami, and I thought, all right, three years off of work unplanned is a lot to absorb financially. So it's time to get back to work. So I was kind of shopping around opportunities. I realized that a lot of what I do is making rich people richer. And that, I wanted to live with my heart. It was a big transformational 3 years for myself and my family in a number of ways. And I wanted to do something with heart. So I really wanted to run a nonprofit. And so I was interviewing for some CEO roles in nonprofits. And my sister-in-law, who's very gifted at business and in the legal world, was kind of helping me, shopping my resume out. And I wound up at Costa Farms. It was kind of serendipitous that they wanted to grow, and they were looking for somebody to help them. They were about a $350 million a year business. They wanted to be $1 billion a year business. And so I had the opportunity to work with them for a few years to help, lay out the plan and get them going, do some coaching, development of leadership skills and organizational structure and things like that. It was a great opportunity. And so what Costa Farms does is they are the largest grower of indoor and outdoor house plants. So a lot of what you see in, Lowe's or Home Depot garden centers, that's theirs. That's what they do. And an amazing operation. They have, 5,500 acres of farmland, tremendous. They distribute 360 million plants a year. I mean, and it's a very complex business. So it was a great challenge. I never would have thought that I would have enjoyed, working with them and doing that. But, I got them moving in the right direction, and it was time to move on. So.
Interesting. I'm curious. So I used to live in Princeton, which was right down the street from the Manuel Diaz nurseries. Are they still in business? Did Costa Farms maybe buy them along the way? I don't know the history there, but I didn't see them when I went back many months ago to visit. We drove down to the old neighborhood, and I was like, where's this giant nursery that was acres and acres and acres? It's now developments of homes.
Yeah, Princeton's changed a lot, huh?
Yeah.
So Manny Diaz and his son Nick, which is now running the business, they were in a different space. So they grew trees, and trees are very long-term crop, and so they don't play in the same space that Costa Farms did. Costa tries to get things that grow a little bit quicker, so you can have greater returns on your land. But Manny and Nick, they're still in business. So they're consolidating space and moving more out of South Florida into kind of the Central Florida space a little bit.
Okay.
Land is cheaper up there.
Part of the reason I asked you about Costa Farms was to get to a mutual connection that we have that I didn't know about until we kind of caught up the other day. Bill Flaherty, so he was a guy I worked for. He was my boss when I worked at Blockbuster. If you didn't already guess from the gray hair, I'm not in my 20s. So I worked at Blockbuster back in the day when we were growing like crazy. And Bill was one of my bosses. I'm hoping to get on the podcast at some point. I'm going to talk to him later today. How did you? It was through Costa Farms that you guys met, right? What was the connection there?
So Bill is on the board of Costa Farms, and he had a working relationship with Ho Chi Smith, who's the CEO at Costa Farms, from years and years ago. And Bill was a mentor, and a very really, I don't know him well, but my first impression, just based on the way people respond to him, what little I do know of him, the few times I've talked to him, a wonderful man, and very smart in terms of business, and probably more, not necessarily book smarts, and I don't know his background, but you can just tell he's a very intuitive leader and a very intuitive businessman. I think those are the ones that they just naturally know how to have the right conversations, how to lead and guide. And so he was a mentor. He was around in the organization. Like I said, I don't know him well, but he carried a lot of weight, and what he said, was very important to the organization.
Interesting. I just always find it interesting how, like, you and I reconnected after 20 something odd years, and in a short catch-up call, I realized that you knew Bill, you knew Neil Richardson. I'll ask you about him in a minute. That these connections I didn't even realize over all the years that we had. Bill was a mentor to me as well. And I guess it would be fair to say I don't know him really well either, because I worked for him for a couple of years, many, many years ago. And, you know, we had like one catch-up call like 10 or 12 years ago. So, but when I worked for him, the nickname that we referred to him as was the professor. Because even in a group of guys, so I think his MBA, I think he got his MBA at Chapel Hill, but we had guys in that group that I worked in that were all like top of the food chain, smart, hardworking guys. And even in that group, he was referred to as the professor. But he took me under his wing and was very, very much a mentor to me as well. Taught me a lot of things, and I learned a lot just from just paying attention to him in meetings. And to your point about, he seemed to just intuitively know the right questions to ask. And I tried to just kind of be a sponge when I was around him. So the other guy that we knew in common was Neil Richardson. So I haven't talked to him since I worked for him 30 some odd years ago, but was it through JC's that you said you, yeah. So Neil Richardson had, when I worked for him, he owned a direct mail company. They just sent out direct mail pieces. But he was very big in the political world because he did direct mail campaigns for a lot of politicians or aspiring politicians. But I think the connection there was he got me involved in JC's. And I guess that's where you had met him.
Yeah, so, I think I only met him once, maybe twice, but he had a profound impact on my life. He was
1 or 2 meetings.
Yeah, well, and I only remember one. I remember him giving a presentation, and you know, I'm probably 18 years old at the time, maybe 19 years old. And this was really kind of the first professional organization, semi-professional organization that I'd been involved in. And, you know, we were able to do good work. And he was giving a talk. I don't remember where we were. I remember the room was very crowded. And I'm struggling with who I am and, you know, trying to hide myself. And you know, really, it was just such a tumultuous time for me to figure out how to be an adult. I'd been basically on my own since I was 15 years old and trying to figure out, like, all right, how do I come out of my shell? How do I do this? How am I successful? And I watched him on stage, and my response to him was the same response that I had to Tony Robbins. He was so charismatic and so in command of the room from the front.
Yep.
That I literally just looked and said, that's what I want to be right there. And I had the same response to Tony Robbins, just listening to him. I didn't get to see Tony Robbins until years later. I saw him in like maybe 1991 in Fort Lauderdale, and I had worked a midnight shift. I'm kind of taking a tangent off of Neil here, but to get the perspective, 1991, I was working midnight shift running a nuclear power plant, right? I worked all night long and then went to Fort Lauderdale to see Tony Robbins. I'm dead tired. And he was so engaging. I stayed awake and excited the entire day. But there was a moment where there was a pregnant woman in the front of the room who passed out. And of course, the fervor in this auditorium that probably had 15,000 people in it, right? And everything starts to build. He took command of that room in an instant, had everybody quiet, and in that very deliberate, calm voice, he worked through and kept everybody calm, and they moved the lady out. And I thought then too, that's who I want to be. That way of being able to command a room, and I'm nowhere like him or Neil, but that was the impact Neil had on that to this day I remember him, and I remember very specifically, some of the things that he said that were profound.
Interesting. When you were talking, for some reason, I remembered something that he said to me that was in no way profound, but I still remember it because it speaks to influence. And what I realized later, the effect that it had, it fascinated me. It was a simple matter of, it was the end of the day. I worked for him in his business, and at the end of the day, we were all done and we were getting ready to go home, and we were just sitting around just kind of chatting. And he says, "Hey, John, you worked really hard today." He's like, "I've got some beers in that fridge over there. Why don't you go grab yourself a beer? You earned it." And I kind of thought, oh, wow, the boss thinks I did a good job. And I go over and I go to grab a beer, and he goes, "Hey, while you're there, if there's two, could you bring me one?" And in that moment, I thought, wow, that was kind of slick. And for just a nanosecond, I felt manipulated. And then I thought, hey, it's not that big a deal. It's just, I kind of laughed about it. But I've never forgotten that one little thing was, to me, when I look back after I've learned all these, lessons about psychology and influence and persuasion, that was a very simple way of motivating me to do something he wanted me to do that was win-win, that some people might look at and go, well, that was manipulative. You can make that argument. That's fine. I won't even argue with you about it. But in hindsight, I think about that as a lesson, right? He found a very simple way to get me to do something. And it was win-win for everybody. And most people would not even pick up on that, probably. But I think only in hindsight that I analyze it, and it still sticks with me. Fascinating.
Well, and he had a tremendous level of emotional awareness, right? He knew emotional intelligence, I guess is the word I'm looking for, but he had a tremendous amount of that. You could just tell the way people responded to him, and that was one of the things that I wanted to emulate later. And I've given, I don't know, 50 or 60 talks, right, from the stage, if you will. My self-deprecating mindset that I battle with is at odds with that, right? Where I'll get up and I am, thundering away and delivering a message, and, the whole room's in tears or in laughter. And you can feel that moment when you're having that effect on somebody. And then the moment I walk away, I'm thinking, they'll never remember who I am. I'm telling myself all of those lies. And then to come back later, and someone will say, man, you touched my life, or you changed my life, or, those moments. And I just said all of that, not to glorify anything that I do, but that was the effect that you see with someone like Neil Richardson, who knew how to deliver a message, knew how to communicate, knew what people wanted to hear. And I think those traits and those characteristics, it's what made him, in part, what made him successful, what endeared him to people, for sure. But that's when you see truly successful people, that ability to communicate and relate. The communications and relationship part is so valuable to people, that you're really limiting your success if you can't find that in some way.
Yep. Neil, if you're out there watching, I want to interview you. I want to catch up and interview you. I have no idea what he's been up to since I left working for him, lost touch, have no idea. My guess is probably big success, because he was already very successful when I was working for him. So we're at the top of the hour, and I want to respect your time. Do you have time for one more question?
I have all the time you want.
Okay, then I will steal two questions since you said that. The first one is, you touched on speaking. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on, when you are preparing to do, whether it's, you call it speaking or presenting or training or whatever the case, I have seen so many different approaches to that, from memorize everything to the opposite extreme of just pick a topic and have a deep enough level of expertise that you can kind of wing it. What is your approach when you're going to deliver some kind of a speech or a presentation?
You just, slight tangent here, but you just reminded me, when I was at Florida Power and Light, I had gotten moved to another department to, make something happen there. And I worked for a woman who she was a taskmaster. I mean, she's very sharp, very capable. And I'm, I tend to be kind of jokey sometimes. I love to laugh. I love all of that. And people miss that in my demeanor because I'm so bottled up with worrying about who I am, right? But I just love to laugh and love to be funny. So we were giving a big presentation to the company, and I wanted it to be fun. So I came up with this whole creative thing, and we mixed Survivor with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And I was dressed as Regis Philbin and the whole thing. And she wanted to know, all right, go through the script with me. How are you going to do this? And I jokingly said, oh, I'm just going to wing it. And she got right in my face and she said, we don't wing. And so whenever I answer this question, which I do a lot, about how I prepare and all of that, I always think of Leanne saying, we don't wing. So what I have found is that I judge it by what I don't like and what I see that works. So if somebody stands at the front of the room and is reading, or if they have a text-heavy PowerPoint and they're turned around and they're reading it, nobody wants that. I don't know anybody that is really enthused by that kind of presentation. So if what I'm doing involves any kind of presentation, I leverage something called the picture superiority effect, or PSE, and that is to have them associate some visual with what I'm saying, because that, statistics show that the absorption is higher. If I do have to use words, and this number is a little bit high, but no more than 40 words on a slide ever. So I try and keep that boiled down. So I approach it right, wrong, or indifferent. This is what works for me. I map out and I look at it like a 3-act play. So I kind of, every presentation introduces an antagonist, or every good presentation in my mind introduces an antagonist, right? There's some problem, there's some emotional hook, there's something, right? And then there is the kind of overcome moment. And then there's, what do we do now? And so most of my presentations are either around, I give a lot around, my personal experiences with homeless and abuse and whatever. So it's always that, right? I'll start with that story, how I overcame it. And then, hey, what can you do now, kind of thing. If it's a professional presentation, I try and follow the same thing, because usually you're giving a presentation because you're solving some problem, right? Sales are low and you want to do a sales kickoff. Okay, what's the antagonist? Why are sales low? How are we going to overcome it? And then, how do we leave the room? So that's what I do. I don't fully script everything, although I do, I storyboard it. I'm a big storyboard fan. And so, I want to talk about this general topic and either these visuals or these talking points. And I'll work that into a good flow. Every presentation is telling a story at some level. And so you really have to look at how am I telling the story? Am I telling the story in a way that people want to listen to the story? And so I do that. And then I rarely speak with notes, rarely. Sometimes, if it's a data heavy presentation, I'm not that good with, my memory. So I have to do notes. But even then, it'll just be bullet points. But one of the tools that I use is something, I don't believe this was the actual name when I learned it, but something I call a story mansion. And so what I do is I break the entire presentation down into its key components. And I visualize a home that I used to live in. It had a big grand entryway. And then you could kind of circle the entire house going from room to room. And what I do is mentally place the key talking points in the room visually. So if I'm going to talk about my childhood and I'm going to talk about my, physically abusive father, he's in the room, so that I walk in, I give my intro, I go into that room because that's the next place in the story. And then I visualize all of the key parts. When you become familiar with that and you get used to it, it's a immensely powerful tool. But it requires the power of visualization. And if it's a highly emotional topic, the first time I did it and I placed my father in the room, I kind of got hung up at that moment a little bit. So you have to be able to overcome that. But that's how I do it. I structure it, in that 3-act play style, and then and kind of work through.
Yeah, the approach that you just explained, I've heard referred to as the memory castle.
Okay.
A pretty common from, at least for people who study that kind of stuff. I've not used it for presentations, but I've used it to try to remember different other things. There's so many memory, I was going to say tricks. It's not really a trick, techniques that can be super helpful for that. But I also, it sounds like your 3-act play is a very, very boiled down, simplified version of the hero's journey that you just kind of made a little easier to digest, which I think is really smart, because the hero's journey, I think it's 13 or 16 steps if you go through the whole thing formally. And I made the mistake of trying to teach accountants that once. And then afterwards I was like, what were you thinking? What? 3 things, dude, 3 things, keep it to 3 things. Yeah. But I felt like it was such a strong idea when I learned about it. I think I got to share this. They got to know that this will make their communication so much more effective. Yeah, that was a terrible idea. Your 3-pronged approach is much more effective, I think. So the last thing that I wanted to ask you about, I got an impression that one of the things you spend a lot of time on, at least now, is your Luke 24 ministries. Is that accurate?
Well, one of many things, yeah. But I devote a lot of time to my faith and to service through the church. Yeah.
Okay, maybe the reason that I got that impression is I saw on your Facebook a picture of, I don't know if it was a presentation you were doing when you were wearing a Superman costume. You mentioned a costume earlier, which is what reminded me of that. Do you want to talk about what that ministry is?
Sure. So that ministry is really an amalgamation of a lot of different things. So we focus on, so there's a men's component, right? And leading retreats or teaching, things like that, just to help men be, the spiritual head of the household, to be in the role that we're designed for and destined to be. Then there's a woman's component, right? And my wife leads that and work with women on similar things, right? What is the role? What is the right place? What is the, how can you live an amazing life and still have a faith? That has also become part of youth ministry. I wind up doing a lot of youth ministry, run summer camps, week-long summer camps, and just work with them to understand that there's a God, that there's a purpose for our life, and then how that can fit into the social construct that is, the world we live in. And then we also work on strengthening marriages, mostly through, the testimony of what we've been through, to help people understand that that relationship with your spouse is vital for your own personal health, and that the outflow of a strong and healthy marriage is far more powerful than any single one of us. And so that's really the focus of what we do within that. And it takes a number of different forms. The picture that you referred to, I was giving a talk called The Mask. It's about the masks that we wear to hide who we are or who we think we are, and those kind of things. And that persona for me was one that I developed when I was a kid. And kind of going through what we were going through. I would hide, in the basement. When we lived in Illinois, I would hide in the basement and watch Superman on a little black and white television. And what really, I think it was more of a subconscious than a conscious thing, but I would look, and Superman, when he was a hero, everybody loved Superman, right? But when he was Clark Kent, and he had his, he had his insecurities in those moments, right? And I could quickly see that if you're Superman, there's more of a chance there. And so the mask that I've worn most of my life is to be Superman, to be involved in everything, to be the best at everything, to at least appear as the knight in shining armor, if you will. And then the problem that I always had there was when people would scratch below the surface and realize that I wasn't Superman, that I was more of a Clark Kent, that I would just kind of cut off those relationships. And so I teach now, hey, we all wear masks, right? But it's okay to remove that mask. It's okay to be who you are. And that actually you have far more value than you'll ever realize. And so that's what was going on. That was right before it started. And there was 50 guys in there that were praying over me, for the talk, which is an amazingly powerful experience.
Very cool. So I have a selfish question for you, since you touched on the fact that you talk about marriage and you teach different things to help people have better marriages, healthy marriages. So I'll be 56 in a week or two. I have to check my calendar. I don't even know how old I am half the time. I have a birthday coming up, but at my age, I've never been married. I don't have any kids. But my girlfriend and I have talked about getting married. It's on the horizon. And I'm always thinking about, and it's funny, I didn't plant this. I promise you I didn't plant this here. But this is Relationship Breakthrough by Chloe Madonis. Mm-hmm. So Chloe Madonis is partners with Tony Robbins in that coaching training. This is one of the books that she wrote. And being this sort of never-ending improvement-minded person, I'm always trying to think about, in different areas, not just business or physical fitness, but even like in relationships, working on improving those. What is maybe one or two, I don't want to put you on the spot to have to rank like the best one, but one or two things that you might suggest to people that to improve their relationship, whether it's marriage or otherwise?
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one. So I'll take you back to something that I said earlier. There's no intimacy without vulnerability. Your marriage should be the most intimate relationship that you have. Your spouse should know you, the best of you and the worst of you. Like fully know the best of you and the worst of you. And this even, ties into that partnership conversation, right? You're entering into a partnership of sorts, and that spouse has to know those things, because they are designed to be, that whole structure is designed and given to us as a means of healing that wounded child that we have, right? And so your spouse takes on, when they become your spouse, they take on the role of helping you be the person that you're intended to be. And you have to understand that going in. I think that's what makes for a healthy relationship. So when we get the opportunity to talk to couples before they become married, right? That it's a much better conversation, because look, this is what you're taking on. This is what it means. So that is key. I'll recommend a book to you called Getting the Love That You Want. It's written by a man, Dr. Harville Hendricks. That book changed my life, changed my marriage tremendously. And that is really what we teach straight out. Those principles are what we teach other couples. So the tools that you use to be successful in a relationship are the open communication. And in the challenging times, so there is a particular way of communicating, mirroring, and you'll kind of see all of that if you read the book. Those things have been essential in our relationship. Because what happens, and you see this professionally, you see this in friendships, families, whatever, people tend to listen to respond, right? And not listen to understand. And one of the things that we learned in that book and in taking the coursework to teach that is this whole mirroring process of hearing, repeating back. And it sounds overly formal, but it's a lifesaver. The other thing that we learned was something called the art of the appreciation. And there are times that you'll be challenged in your relationship where it feels like sand in the gears, where it feels like it's not working, where, you know, your spouse or your girlfriend or your fiance is not, you know, you guys aren't clicking. And we learned this appreciation that we say every night, where, you know, I would say, for example, John, what I really appreciate about you today is that you gave me the opportunity to be on your podcast. And then you would repeat it back in the typical communication form. And then I go into, instead of just leaving it there, it would be, the reason I appreciate that is because it allows me to connect with you in a relationship we haven't had for 35 years or whatever it's been, and allowed me to get to know you as the adult version of you. And then you repeat that back, and then you end it with, and that made me feel connected, validated, whatever one word adjective that made me feel. And you know, again, it can feel mechanical in the beginning, but I will tell you that really what's happening in all of that is it is allowing you to recognize the fact that you do appreciate that person when it may be hard sometimes. And some days I may not feel like I appreciate my wife, right? Especially when she's calling out for my behavior. But when I go to bed and, you know, my love, what I appreciated about you today is, you know, you got me a cup of coffee in the middle of the day, or you got me, you know, you took care of the dogs for me, whatever it is. And some days it's a stretch. But if you just find the thing, it changes your focus from all of the negative things to the positive thing, even if there's just one, and there's always at least one. And those things, I actually started doing those things in the workplace. That's actually part of the coaching, the communication, the dialogue, and then the appreciation. Hugely powerful things. So that's my gift to you for your relationship.
Awesome. I'm definitely going to get that book. That one question, and then what for me was like the kicker that kind of put it at the next level is the reason I appreciate that is people need to have a why to really feel connected to anything, whether it's business, personal, it doesn't matter. And we make a point when we talk to each other every day on the phone to start out. And we both kind of thought of this, the whole 80-20 rule, right? We could talk for an hour, but if we're not paying attention to focusing on at least a few of the right things, we may spend that hour on just kind of surface level, what happened today, like a timeline, and never actually get to the important stuff because we're not focusing on it. So we try to make a habit of starting out. Our questions are not as good as the ones that you just articulated, though. So I'll definitely grab that book. I love that. One last question, and I'll let you go because it's approaching 11:30, and I do want to respect your time. Even though you said you have lots of it, I know you're a very busy guy. As a coach, something that I struggle with constantly is not slipping into coach mode with loved ones. Right? It's one of the things that in that Tony Robbins coach training they talked about at the end of the training is, I think they said it was either one or two students that they've had in the entire history of their program. Only one or two of them have reported back that I coached a loved one and it went great. Right? Typically, someone will report back, hey, I tried to coach my wife on something and it just, it was a disaster. What are your thoughts on how do you, when you see a situation, whether it doesn't have to be your wife or your child, it could just be a friend or whoever, how do you handle that sometimes when you go, oh, I could help you with that, but They're not asking for coaching. You've got to run into that. I'm curious, do you have any specific strategies you've used to sort of manage that urge to go into coach mode when you know it might not be the best time to do that? This is another selfish question for me, but I think it'll help other people.
I think I rely on self-preservation mode for that. But so I'll tell you, I don't even think my family knows that I coach.
Okay.
I mean, they do, but they probably don't connect. So we don't have that kind of relationship. Now, I have worked with my sister-in-law in the past, but I almost always wait to be asked, because I'm hypersensitive to wanting to sound like a know-it-all, and I know I'm not a know-it-all for sure. So I don't really insert myself. It would be a rare occasion if I did, and it would probably be something like, wow, kind of the feel, felt, found, right? That we've all learned, man, that must feel terrible, or I understand how you feel. I used to feel that way. What I found is if I did this, then that, I try and fit that in, because it comes off as being less, hey, I know what I'm talking about. I'm perfect. And, I can help you. But most of the time I just keep my mouth shut. So in the family, I do get a lot of people come to me for advice or guidance and things like that. I just let them come, and then I give them what they're looking for in the bare minimum, because I know that's a slippery slope. Now, I said all of that, and I'll tell you that I do coach my wife on the business side. She's vice president of development, fundraising for a very large homeless center called Chapman Partnership, name dropping here. So I help the organization with strategy. I help her and her team specifically with the strategy, and laying out the plan and working to the plan. And then I'm her coach. It's very informal. It's not a formal structure. She refers to me as her coach. She knows that I have experiences that she just doesn't have, and she's willing to ask. But even there, I'm very, very cautious to try not to volunteer. What you should do here is, that, or, what I would do is that. I really try to avoid that. I'm not great at avoiding it. Sometimes I do insert myself, but usually she'll go, I need you to coach me, or, hey, I want you to be my coach now. And so we kind of shift modes. It's a tactical strike. You get in and get out and stop being coach, because we have run into problems, right? We have a difference of opinion, and we're close to each other, and tensions run high, and it's not worth it. It's not worth damaging a relationship over.
Yeah, that's great advice. The thing that I've learned related to this that's had the most impact for me is that the quality of your relationship with that person has a direct bearing on how they receive coaching. On top of everything you said, right? So if you don't have a certain level of trust that person feels like going into every conversation, that I have no hidden agenda, that if I'm offering any advice or coaching, it comes from a place of love and trying to help. Obviously, even with that level of trust and everything, there still can be those roadblocks. But I think that was a big learning for me, was you have to earn that level of trust before that person is likely to come and ask for help on anything.
Oh, absolutely. Even in, my hired clients, it's and to overuse the expression, it's found its way into this discussion a lot. There's no intimacy without vulnerability. If you're coaching and you're coaching well, it's an intimate relationship, right? You have to. My wife hates this expression, but you got to get into the underwear drawer, right? To really understand what makes people tick. And so I spend a lot of time up front, just who are you? Where do you come from? The relationship building before we ever get into coaching mode. And it's something that I have a program called Quick Focus Coaching, where I offer unlimited 15-minute sessions And it's kind of all business, right? In 15 minutes, it's just, hey, Kendall, I'm struggling with this. What do you think? And then I'll give you homework and you go off, and then you can schedule your next session. But even that, I spend the time up front, an hour at least, just getting to know who you are. And the more of that, it just leads to a better relationship. And it's the strength of the relationship, to your point. The strength of the relationship dictates how well you can actually coach.
Yep, that's a great point. Parting shot. I stole this question from Tim Ferriss, but I think it's a great way to sort of end an interview. And the question is very simple, and you can take it however you want to take it. If I gave you a billboard, and the only caveat was that you can't put an advertisement for any business on it, what would you put on that billboard?
So you said I cannot make it an advertisement for my business?
Correct.
Or a business? I would rely on, I would send the message that God loves you. I mean, at the end of the day, it's my belief that everything is predicated on the fact that God loves me. Everything I have is a result of him. And I want people to know that, because I found that life-changing when I realized that the hole in my heart could only be filled by one thing, and that's him. So that's what I would put on a billboard. Actually, awesome. I sponsor a guy who puts that on billboards in Connecticut.
I love it. I love it. Well, dude, thank you so much for your time. I could talk to you all day, but like I said, got to respect your time, but I would love to have you back for another conversation down the road at some point. And next time I'm back in Miami, let's catch up, grab something to eat, cup of coffee, drink, whatever. So I love talking to you, man. It's a great conversation.
Likewise. And I'll make my way to Charlotte, and we'll do it in both places.
Sounds good, man. All right. Thanks again for everybody out there watching. We will see you next time. Thanks for watching.